Once a person is baptized, they can never be unbaptized. It's sort of like, well, first of all, baptism is an indelible character impressed upon the soul for all eternity, like the priesthood. No one can take it away. Even the priesthood of Judas Iscariot could not be taken away. It's sort of like trying to get the toothpaste back into the tube. It can never be done.
Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless his holy name.
This is going to be a revision of one of my previous interviews with Father Iannuzzi before, and I feel that the questions that I asked during that interview, a lot of them are very good questions, and something which I see a lot of people are still asking in the comments. So I'm not going to be making a lot of commentary in this video, and I'll simply be sharing the answers provided by Father Iannuzzi here. So let's start with this one, about the unbaptized babies.
Unbaptized babies do not belong to the devil. All we have to do is read Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger's statement on this. He said they are not responsible for original sin, which they did not commit. They inherit it by conception. That's not a personal sin. So Cardinal Ratzinger goes on to say that they are not denied the glory of heaven, the unbaptized baby, And I spoke earlier of the three types of baptism. And if we look at the babies that were martyred at the time of Christ's birth in Ramah, where Herod tried to kill all the firstborn, they're declared martyrs. Some people say, well, how can they be martyrs when they didn't even attain the age of reason? They didn't deliberately give their lives for Christ, but yet the church considers them martyrs. Now, when a woman procures an abortion, I would say the majority of women don't realize that they are making a sacrifice to Satan. Why do I say this? Because in that child is a potential of millions of virtuous and divine acts that increase the accidental glory of creation, that creation is being deprived of through that abortion. So by snatching those acts in the future that the child, when it attains the age of reason, can give God, even in its tender years, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, whatever, are being stolen. And the parents don't realize this, that are procuring this abortion. And in that sense, it is truly a sacrifice to Satan, but the parents may not be aware of this. So the child is not guilty of any original sin. So it's not the possession of the devil. And if it dies in that state of unbaptized innocence, it does not go to hell. Nowhere in the church's teaching will you find this. For many years, scholastic theologians created a theory, not a truth, a theory of limbo that Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, in his book entitled The Ratzinger Report, shot down. He said theologians of the West came up with an idea, since baptism is necessary for salvation and the unborn babies are not baptized, they cannot make it to heaven, so they end up not in hell, but in this place called limbo. Cardinal Ratzinger, rightly so, stated there's no theological foundation for this theory of limbo. And back then, of course, it was not articulated that there were different types of baptism. See, the scholastics, when they came up with this theory, not all of them, some, were assuming that you had to be only sacramentally baptized to get to heaven. And Lumen Gentium of the Second Vatican Council, Article 16, clarified that there are different types of baptism by which someone may enter heaven. And I addressed that in another area. Baptism of desire, baptism of blood, and baptism of sacrament.
In the diary of St Gemma, she shared this, about the time when her guardian angel ordered her to write the following: "Remember, daughter, that whoever truly loves Jesus speaks little and bears all things. I command thee, on behalf of Jesus, to always refrain from giving your own opinion, unless it is asked, always to prefer silence to upholding your own views." So I asked Father Iannuzzi about this. Why would the angel tell her to refrain from giving opinions?
It's a twofold answer. Number one, the word that is used here is opinion. That's a key word. It doesn't say, for example, founded concern or decisions taken in discernment. It says opinion. Opinion means something that is not grounded necessarily upon reflection, discernment, or truth. Number two, a similar example is in the life of St. Faustina. When the nuns with whom she lived, not all but a few, vexed her, gave her difficulty, and God exhorted Faustina to be very merciful with them. And one day Faustina replied to God saying, but they're taking advantage of my mercy and goodness. And God's response to her was, that is not a concern of yours. I will deal with that. I'm paraphrasing. But the question is, well, Does that apply to all the things Faustina does? Should she always let people walk over her like a doormat? Of course not. Should we always keep silent and let people speak things even if they're wrong and make their decisions even if we know it's wrong? Of course not. So if our opinion is grounded in the truth and the result of discernment or even counsel, then we have an obligation to speak. And this is in the Catholic Catechism. It's in the Church's moral casuistry, moral teaching. I'll give you a few examples. Mother Teresa of Calcutta, whom I met twice, she joined a community of nuns, Dorothean sisters, and she decided to leave the community in which she had made vows to establish a community that was more devoted to the poor. So initially, her Mother Superior refused her consent, and Sister Mother Teresa of Calcutta waited, consulted with her bishop in India, and after over a year, finally the Mother Superior said, okay, you can go. Now, suppose Mother Teresa kept quiet and didn't express any of her opinion. She would have never founded this community of the Missionaries of Charity. She followed what the Lord put in her heart, so she should have spoken, and she did. Another example is Father Benedict Rochelle or Charles de Foucauld, St. Ignatius of Loyola. These are founders who had listened to the voice of God and acted upon it, but always with seeking counsel and discernment. So when the Lord talks about opinion, he's not referring to a decision expressed that is founded upon counsel and discernment. He's not talking about that. Take, for example, also the Blessed Virgin Mary herself. When the angel Gabriele appeared to her and told her that she would become the Mother of God, did she say, yes? No, she didn't. She said, how is this possible? She questioned. And that is because she did not simply want to obey blindly with her will without her intellect, but with both. She wanted to give a complete human consent of mind and body to God's fiat by giving him her own fiat with her mind and with her will. And then there's this heresy back in the 17th century of quietism that was condemned by the church. Quietism was proposed by a Spanish priest by the name of Miguel de Molinas, and it denied the necessity of human activity in one's own sanctification. In other words, you don't express your opinion, you don't speak, you just do whatever you're told. And the church has condemned that approach of quietism. Quietism asserts that the highest spirituality is attained when the mind and the will are completely inactive, sort of like a doormat. Now, Pope Pius XI condemned 68 propositions of the founder of this movement, so to speak, Miguel de Molinas. And so the point is, this applies to Faustina especially, but it means opinion and not so much decisions taken in discernment. The First Vatican Council spoke about the importance of obedience and how Christians are to obey. I'll give you just a few examples. Gaudium et Spes, number 17. This is the hope and joy, Gaudium et Spes in Latin, the Second Vatican Council document. Number 17 of this conciliar document states that obedience to God is not, as some would believe, a heteronomy. Heteronomy means a military obedience. You just blindly obey as if the moral life was subject to the will of something absolute, extraneous, intolerant of one's own freedom. So the church condemned this idea of blind obedience. It's even stated that such a heteronomy would be nothing but a form of alienation, contrary to God's divine wisdom and to the dignity of the human person. In other words, God made no one to be a doormat. Human dignity requires man to act through conscious and free choice. And if God puts something in his heart that may change a bad situation to good, he has an obligation to say it, okay? And another document that reiterates this teaching on the church's informed and not blind obedience is the Apostolic Exhortation Vita Consecrata by Pope John Paul II the Great. In number 43 of this Apostolic Exhortation, Vita Consecrata, which is consecrated life in English, he stated that authority must be above all fraternal and spiritual, while those entrusted with it must know how to involve their brothers and sisters in the decision-making process, meaning that the superior is not supposed to blindly command the subject. Because, for example, let's take a superior who tells the student, jump off the third-floor building because I told you. Would you do it? Of course not. It's sinful to take one's own life in that way. In fact, I was asked when I was a seminarian in Italy in 1991 by the novice master who was training us in the vows of poverty, chastity, obedience. I said, concerning obedience, what if you told me to jump off the top of a fifth floor building? Am I supposed to obey you? And he said to me, what would you do? And I said to him, I would say, after you. And he smiled and he said, good answer. And that's the way we are to engage in this dialogue, whether it's Gemma Galgani with her peers or her elders, or just with a religious and a superior, or even among ourselves, parents and children and so forth. You know, according to this diary, the guardian angel related this to her. Now, the guardian angels cannot say anything that's not consistent with the will of God because they enjoy the beatific vision, which renders them impeccable, immutable. They participate in God's impeccability, immutability, and so forth. So even though it may have come through the angel, it was inspired, we assume, by God. And remember, Gemma Galgani, she also underwent diabolic attacks. Sometimes she would look at the food and see worms and wouldn't eat because the devil tried to tempt her that way. And she knew how to discern God's spirit from the bad spirit. But even the saints, sometimes when they write, they have to use their own words. You see, oftentimes when God reveals himself, he reveals himself through a light of infused knowledge and not with words. In fact, the subject of my doctoral dissertation, Luisa Picaretta, speaks of the 4 ways in which God revealed himself to her. And one way, and the most common way, is without words. So it's sort of like you getting, in a split second, a treasure trove of knowledge that causes you to ponder and reflect and contemplate for the next week. This profound information is given to you in the substance of your soul, but no words are given, just information like images, patterns of thought. But you now have to come up with the words and articulate what you experienced. That oftentimes is how Gemma received messages. So she uses these words like opinion, but it's not like she literally heard those words from the angel.
I also asked Father Iannuzzi about Vatican II.
In these end times, because St. Paul, who foresaw that the rebellion would take place in the end times before the man of lawlessness is revealed in 2 Thessalonians, knew that there would be this division within the church. So this rebellion that's taking place within the church, not without, but within, that's what apostasy in Greek means, rebellion from within the church, has a lot to do with people separating themselves from the magisterium and Rome, and this is dangerous. I think the quick answer to your question, why did the Church have Vatican II, is under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, which is the answer as to why it always has a council. Yes, there were practical reasons, and that is an answer to the changing moral, bioethical, technological advancements that are happening in these modern times that did not happen 100 years ago. In the last 150 years, there's been more technological advancement than in the last 6,000 combined. So the church had to not keep up with the times, that's a bad answer, but articulate answers to new questions that did not exist before, like in vitro fertilization, colonization, etc. Also, Pope John the 23rd, who is a saint, he stated that we have to open up a window because the church needs the Holy Spirit to breathe in it. And lo and behold, not only he, but his successor, Pope John Paul II, employed the expression new Pentecost. We need a new Pentecost. And shortly thereafter, after they began using these expressions, Jesus began to reveal himself using these very expressions in the writings of mystics, blesseds, venerables, servants of gods, and saints that are approved by the church, like Blessed Elizabeth of the Holy Trinity, Blessed Dina Belanger, Venerable Conception Contraria de Armida, Luisa Picaretta, Saint Faustina, Father Gobi, Father Padre Pio. They talk about this new Pentecost. Father Gobi too, right? Who's a servant of God. And I think that the reason why they criticize Vatican II is because for many centuries, the liturgy was always in Latin in the Western world, okay? And even though the Orthodox have the same 7 valid sacraments as the Catholics and believe 99% of what Catholics believe, and Pope John Paul II called the Orthodox another lung in the one mystical body of Christ, the second of which is the Western Church. Even though these statements have been made, we have to remember that the liturgy did not start in Latin. It started in Aramaic. I love the Latin Mass, and what I'm about to say is in no way disrespectful to it. In fact, I have faculties to celebrate in the extraordinary form, the ordinary form, and the Byzantine form. Byzantine is basically the Orthodox Mass, but under the Pope. And the oldest liturgy was not Latin. It was Aramaic. And if you want to know which liturgy most resembles that of the apostles, it is not the Latin Mass, it is not the Novus Ordo English Mass. It is the Orthodox Mass. That most resembles the Mass of the Apostles. St. John Chrysostom updated it. There were several revisions done to the Orthodox Mass over the centuries. But my point is, I think a lot of times people, when they see that the Mass started to change from Latin to the vernacular, they blame it on Vatican II. But the truth is, it didn't happen in Vatican II. It didn't happen during Vatican II. This adaptation of the Mass to the vernacular language. In fact, even the priest turning his back to the people and facing the people, that did not happen during Vatican II. It happened after Vatican II, right? Pope Paul VI, who is a saint, I think it was 1967, wrote a decree in which he allowed that. But remember, you won't find in Vatican II anything of the church saying you must remove the altar rails, you must remove the tabernacle from the center of the church, you must admit altar girls. Nothing of that is in Vatican II documents. This is all something that came later at the request of the Episcopal convents of bishops, et cetera, et cetera. So my point is, I think they're confused. They don't know the facts, they don't know the dates of events, and they all simplify it and say Vatican II is responsible for all this, but it's not. Vatican II is a very good council, and it was very much needed, in my opinion. And those people who say that all the popes after Vatican II are invalid, again, contradict church doctrine. All they have to do is go to the first Vatican Council that happened, was it 1869 to 1870, and read what it states in the First Vatican Council. It states, whoever succeeds the chair of St. Peter, whoever, it doesn't say these specific people, it means any person who is ordained, who is consecrated pontiff, whoever succeeds the chair of Peter obtains the primacy of Peter over the whole church. So that what the truth has ordained stands firm and blessed. Peter perseveres in the rock-like strength he was granted, perseveres in the rock-like strength he was granted, and does not abandon the guidance of the church which he once received. And that the clergy and faithful of whatever right and dignity are bound to submit to this Petrine power by the duty of hierarchical subordination in true obedience, not blind obedience. And this not only in matters of concerning faith and morals, but also in those which regard the discipline and government of the church throughout the world. It doesn't mean the Pope is infallible on the weather, on sporting events, on medicine or vaccines or borders. No, it talks about just morals, faith, discipline, and governance of the church, not of the world. And the Second Vatican Council that took place between 62 and 65 of last century stated that the religious assent of the will and intellect is to be given in a special way to the authentic teaching authority of the pontiff, even when he is not speaking ex cathedra. Okay? So we must always respect this authority that comes from God through the Vicar of Christ. And all the bishops have an obligation to be in union with him. And when they are not, their authority depreciates. This is found in the Catholic Catechism. I think it's Article 895, that the authority of the bishops must be exercised in communion with the Vicar of Christ and the whole church. Also, Lumen Gentium, Article 22, I think, reiterates that.
And then I also asked Father Iannuzzi why it seems like a lot of priests or Catholics in general refer St. Thomas a lot in matters of faith.
Good question. Well, two answers to that question. Number one, because many popes have recommended Thomas's theology, in particular his Summa Theologica, because it is a masterpiece. Now, Ratzinger was not a great fan of the way that Thomas used the philosophy with the theology, but he also commended Thomas in many respects. So did Francis, Pope Francis, the present pontiff, so did John Paul II, Leo XIII, Benedict XV, and the list goes on and on. So he's well known among the pontiffs as a great theologian. He's called the angelic doctor, among other things. The second answer is because we in the Western world are heavily saturated, and I'm not saying this in a bad way, but it's simply factual. We're heavily saturated with scholasticism. If you go to the Eastern world, you won't find it like that. You'll find it patristic, very Greek theology. The first 1,000 years of Catholicism were predominantly Greek theology. We're predominantly under the tutelage of Greek theologians, patristic thinkers. The second 1,000 years of theology were mostly scholastic in Latin. So we went from the Greek patristic theology of the first 1,000 years of the church to the Western Latin scholastic theology of the West. And now the schism, as they call it, the separation of the East and West happened in 1054, almost right in the middle of the 2,000 years. So there was this transition in the Western world, which includes, those not just geographically those countries of America, Western Europe, but even those ideologically united there too, the Philippines and Kerala, parts of India that are very Catholic. And therefore, in the seminaries, in the novitiate houses, in the catechetical schools, in your Catholic school systems, it's mostly scholastic. And guess who stands out as the leading scholastic theologian? Thomas Aquinas. Certainly there was Bonaventure, who was a contemporary of Aquinas and no less great. In fact, Cardinal Ratzinger preferred Bonaventure over Aquinas. He says that several times. But they're both great. And I appreciate them both equally.
And then I asked Father Iannuzzi about his thoughts on near-death experiences. This was one of the questions that one of you submitted before.
Well, certainly there are a lot of near-death experiences that are authentic, and even some doctors who had no belief in God before these events began to believe afterwards. And I know a few people that have had this experience as well. So it's authentic, but remember, wherever there's truth, there's always someone trying to take advantage of it. So sometimes you have people presenting themselves as someone who's experienced this kind of event, but what do? They make money off of it. Once you see a person using a spiritual event to profit, something's not quite right there. And this is why in recent months, just about a month ago, in fact, the dicastery for the doctrine of faith put out new norms on discerning true from false supernatural phenomena. And this is a supernatural phenomenon, near-death experience, right? Some people have a vision of God, some of the devil, they were taken to hell, right? I know quite a few names, but I won't mention them here.
And this one is about those weddings that are taking place at the beach, mountainside, or anywhere else but the church. So the question was, are these weddings valid?
Yeah. Well, only with the consent of the local ordinary, canon law states, and the local ordinary is the bishop. Only with the consent of the bishop can a wedding take place outside of the church. And the church is the normal place of the sacraments being celebrated. Why? Because it's the house of God and it's a sacred ceremony. There may be exceptions, for example, on the point of death. Let's say a marriage is in the hospital, that can be permitted. Or between mixed religions, let's say one spouse is a Protestant or not, and one is a Catholic or not. And the bishop can give permission for the priest or a deacon to preside while the minister presides as well. And it could be in, let's say, a civil place. So these exceptions to the norm happen only with the bishop's permission. But the question you ask is, are they valid if they're done outside the church or on a beach or on another place? Yes, as long as the norms put in place by canon law are followed and with the consent of the bishop, it is valid. But now suppose they do it without the bishop's consent. Is it valid? It's valid, but it's illicit. See, what makes the marriage valid is the consent of the mutual consent of the spouses, not the priest. Okay, yes, there's a canonical form he recites. Let me very briefly give an overview of what makes the sacraments, all the sacraments, valid and invalid. Matter and form. What is the matter of baptism? Water. What is the form? The invocation of the three divine persons. Now, if one of the two is missing, it's invalid. If both are present, it's valid. So if you, instead of using water, let's say you use Coca-Cola, right? That should be invalid just for that reason itself. No, but it has to be water and the invocation of the Trinity. Same thing with, let's say, confession. What is the matter? The matter is contrition on the part of the penitent. And what is the form? The words of absolution of the priest. With regard to marriage, what is the matter? The mutual consent of the two spouses. And what is the form? The canonical form the priest recites. Now, how do you know that the matter is truly present when it's something intangible and invisible like mutual consent? And the answer to that is why we have so many annulments today. Because sometimes people go into a marriage without being completely transparent with the other concerning something that could invalidate it, but they don't reveal it. For example, I want to marry this person, but I have a hidden child somewhere. And if I tell my bride to be this, they won't want to marry me. Right from the start, that's enough. Because if there's something you're withholding that could alter the decision of the bride to be, and you don't reveal that, that makes the bond invalid. It could be, an addiction, a gambling addiction that you're hiding, and that if the other bride to be knew or bridegroom to be knew, would change the outcome of the decision. Mutual consent. It could be anything. So, considering that the mutual consent is present, and that the priest recites the canonical form, it's a valid marriage wherever it is.
And finally, I'll share this clip of him talking a little bit about exorcisms.
Yeah, the devil does not like anything sacred. I recall when I was participating in exorcisms in Rome with Father Amorth, he would say the Mass before the exorcism, and the person afflicted could not enter the church. They would wait outside. And they were most often than not, in fact, every time, as I recall, they were accompanied by someone that brought them there because they didn't want to go there. However, not all exorcisms are cases of possession. You have possession, you have obsession, you have affliction, vexation, oppression, different types of diabolical manifestation, and not all of them cause the individual to experience aversion toward the sacred. That's prevalent with possessions, especially, okay? The others, it's not so much prevalent. So a person with obsession or oppression or vexation may approach something spiritual, and they don't have these sort of revolting spiritual reactions as a person possessed does. And Father Amorth would perform an exorcism over even those without possession, but with other types of diabolical affliction.
Well then, that will be all for the video this time. And as always, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us, and hopefully all of you have learned a lot from this video. I'll be uploading a brand new interview with Father Iannuzzi later next week, and I'll keep doing interviews like this with the hope that the answers provided by the priests, not only Father Iannuzzi, here will be helpful in explaining the Catholic faith to the non-Catholics watching the videos here, as well as for spiritual formation on spiritual warfare, etc. Anyway, if you like what we do and you'd like to support us, I left a link to our PayPal donation in the description box below, and from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much for your continuous support, contributions, and prayers. And until the next one, thanks again for watching, and may God bless you.